Okay, some people, we all understand, at least some of the customers understand why it is we change the oil in an engine. It's to remove acids and carbon and other contaminants that accelerate the wear on seals and bearings and moving parts and all that kind of stuff, right? Some people might even understand why we change transmission fluid, because the friction material gradually wears off the clutches and contaminates the fluid with a sludge that can wear seals and jam valves. So the people that have read their owner's manual might know that we change coolant because corrosion inhibitors lose their effectiveness over time. But why would anybody change brake fluid? You know, there's no combustion or friction materials to generate harmful byproducts. You know, it's a sealed system, so air, moisture, and other contaminants aren't supposed to be able to get in there. Okay, so why do some manufacturers recommend changing brake fluid and some recommend against it? Some manufacturers say change it, and some say don't. And you know, most of it, I don't know if I've ever seen in a maintenance book where you're supposed to change the power steering fluid, but and differential fluid doesn't usually need to be flushed unless somebody's got water in there, you know. Except we did change it at 7,500 miles when I was working at a Mazda dealership. Every 7,500, I mean, not every 7,500, but the first 7,500 miles, you screw the little plug out and you drain the fluid, put new differential fluid in there because it had worn the gears in and all that. Anyway, part of the answer for this here brake fluid change business can be found in a study completed by the National Institute of Standards and Technology. That's NIST, by the way. And at the request of the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, it was initiated in response to vehicle owners' complaints about the operation and performance of their vehicles' anti-lock brake systems. And they found deposits of what looked like corrosion residue in some ABS control valves, so they asked the researchers to study how brake fluid ages while it's in a brake system, hoping to learn how it influences corrosion. Because, you know, if you go in there and find corrosion, you need to find out why are we having this? You know, we've got this copper alpha reactions test that we do with a little dip strip. You know, that's something that Phoenix Systems came up with. Researchers learned a lot. Their work has helped the service industry develop tools for tests for corrosion in brake system. Some manufacturers have been recommending periodic brake fluid flushing for decades. They never provided a good explanation why. They never said why they wanted it flushed. They just said to flush it. And some people, you know, in the industry say, well, this study that the NIST did is long overdue. And so whether or not that's so, the report provides good background information. So, when hydraulic components were first developed in the 1920s, the only material available for seals, hoses, and other hydraulic parts was natural rubber. What color is natural rubber? It's kind of a white or a gray color. You know, the white walls on your tire, that's the natural color of the rubber. You know, and you know the gangster white walls that used to be all the way up the side of the tire, that wasn't to make the tires pretty. The natural color of the tire was white, and they would put that black stuff, mix it in with the part that met the road because it made it wear longer. And they had no point in putting it on the side, but it made the car look like gangster white walls, you know. But anyway, the first brake fluid was a mixture of castor oil and alcohol. Now, why did they do castor oil and alcohol? That was the first brake fluid, yeah. A lot of people don't know that. It would sort of, well, and it would also keep it from freezing. You know, you put the alcohol in there so it won't freeze. When synthetic customers indeed, when the synthetic, you know, rubber items and plastic parts became available, natural rubber was still in use, and brake fluid had to be compatible with everything. In other words, when they started changing the materials, they were still, some of them still had rubber in them, so the brake fluid they came up with had to not harm the rubber, and it also had to, you know, be compatible with the new materials. And also, you don't need anything that you pour in any brake system that's petroleum based is going to swell the rubber parts up and necessitate an entire brake rebuild. There was a lady that sent me an email through my AskAMechanic.info website, and she said that she had her Honda worked on at a chain store, and she said right after, basically she had some maintenance done, and she said right after that she was driving down the road and the car just kind of stopped and wouldn't go, and all of her rubber parts in the brake system had swelled up and had locked the brakes down, and so she had it, you know, towed to the Honda store, and they said somebody had put petroleum stuff in the brakes and it had destroyed the rubber parts, and it was going to be $5,000 or something to fix it. So she goes back to the chain store, trying to get them to make good on it. And I said, no, we didn't do that. It's on you. Get out of here. Leave us alone. This kind of stuff. So, I mean, it's just one of them nasty situation and all that. Well, anyway, a solvent had to be used, though, when they started making this new brake fluid so that a wider variety of fluids could be mixed together. And while there were several reasonable choices, the industry settled on glycol ether as a natural standard base solvent for hydraulic fluid. Glycol either describes a group of a dozen different solvents that can be glycol ether, not either. It describes a group of dozen different solvents can be mixed with other fluids. And they want to attack natural or synthetic elastomers and won't make them swell and disintegrate the way some other solvents can. Denatured alcohol is good that way because it doesn't attack rubber. Now, one time I was thinking, well, we need to flush the brake fluid on this truck of Papa G's, that little Chevrolet truck, because the brake fluid was so filthy and dark. And, I kind of liked it for brake fluid mostly to be clean. I mean, a lot of people don't think about that, but so we're doing the work on this thing. So we went ahead and used some denatured alcohol, and because Delco used to have something called a D-Clean that was denatured alcohol. It was a sort of a purple color, and you would buy that stuff and flush it brakes out with that. And so I flushed the brakes out with the denatured alcohol in the spirit of doing it with D-Clean like I used to back in the 70s. And darned if I didn't cause a bunch of stuff to turn loose in the ABS unit, this corrosion crud, and it started causing it where the rear brakes wouldn't release. Because when I flushed it with that denatured alcohol, it had a cleansing effect, and there wasn't really a lot of way that trash could get out of there, and it got, locked up in these ABS valves. So I had to put an ABS control valve on it. But so what I learned from that was if you're going to flush the brake system, you need to go ahead and just do it with clean brake fluid. Just pour the brake fluid in there and keep pumping it through until you see nothing but clean, pretty great brake fluid coming out the other end, and now you got clear brake fluid all the way through. But see, the people that are with the ABS problem are worried that you're going to do what happened, what I did on Papa G's truck, and cause the ABS, the big control unit under there on the side of the frame to start holding fluid pressure at the other ones. But anyway, the solvents that they started to use, the glycol ether with that group of different solvents, will attack other materials. And if you ever spill brake fluid on a painted fender, you might recognize how aggressive it can be. Now, I will tell you this. Cars today have got clear coat on them, and they're not as susceptible to be damaged by brake fluid. But you better not be spilling any brake fluid on any paint, or the paint will bubble up and come off of there. Now, like I say, the clear coat typically protects it from that, but that's a bad bet when you're working on somebody's Corvette. Don't spill brake fluid on the paint, because they're going to come back and want you to paint their daggone car if they can see where you've done that, Another thing that makes a glycol ether a good hydraulic fluid is it has low viscosity and a high boiling point. That's what you want when you're working with brakes. It flows about the same way over a wide temperature range. So if it's really cold or if it's really hot, it's always going to flow about the same way, which is important when you're stopping, right? Okay, other components in brake fluid are polyglycol lubricants, solvent modifiers that make fluid compatible with a wider range of elastomers, and an additive package. Some of the additives are corrosion inhibitors, pH stabilizers, and antioxidants. What's a pH stabilizer, Sean?
It'd be like you get sick to your stomach, so you eat some saltine crackers, and the salt kind of mellows out the pH in your gut.
Okay. Well, what is pH anyway?
pH is a scale of acidity or alkalinity.
Okay, so they don't want it to swing too far in either direction, so they put this stabilizer in there where it keeps it pretty well constant. That's the long and short of it. But I don't think I'd put saltine crackers in my brake system, right? Okay, now, well, we were talking, whatever. Anyway, the stability of the fluid and long-term performance of the brake system is really important. And, a lot of times, why is it that you suppose, guys, remember on the Taurus, you had to rebuild the back of the rear bone and put new wheel cylinders? Those things start leaking. They just started leaking. And when the cups that came out of the old wheel cylinders, they didn't look bad, but they were leaking, right? Well, the reason those were leaking, if you take that wheel cylinder apart and you look up in there, you'd see pits of rust up in there. So instead of having a smooth bore, those little rubber seals were sliding across bumpy rust pits, and they was letting fluid get past them. That's why they were leaking. See, it wasn't an attack on the rubber, it was an attack on the steel. And they're not going to make wheel cylinders, not typically, out of aluminum. Now, sometimes you may see a caliper It's got an aluminum piston in it, and in extreme cases, you may even see an aluminum caliper, but most of the time, calipers are made out of cast iron, because they want them to be really good and strong. Okay, but with a lot of different fluid components available, the industry needed some rules to make sure any brand of brake fluid would work in any system, so the U.S. Department of Transportation, what is the acronym for the Department of Transportation?
DMV.
How about, no, that's the Department of Motor Vehicles.
DOT.
Yeah, DOT, that's right. So when I say .3, think about it. That's where I'm talking about, Department of Transportation. That provided the rules, but instead of specifying which solvents, oils, or other chemicals can and can't be used to make brake fluid, they chose to set performance standards, which is a good thing to do, right? Now, that leaves the industry free to make improvements without being tied to specific chemicals. So you can make the brake fluid to the performance standards without having to use certain chemicals. You see, as long as the performance standards are met, then it doesn't matter what you make the brake fluid out of. Is basically what the DOT said. And if it reaches the .3 as a performance standard more than it has exactly these chemicals in it, you got me? But brake fluid's got to pass 14 different tests for approval. And they measure things such as viscosity, evaporation loss, the fluid's ability to inhibit corrosion. And while all brake fluids have the same corrosion and elastomer compatibility standards, the performance specifications we're most familiar with are the wet and dry boiling temperatures. And those standards used to differentiate .3, .4, and .5 brake fluid. All right. Okay, it's because most new cars are equipped with .3 brake fluid. That's what NIST used for all of its testing. And that study was requested because signs of brake system corrosion were found in ABS valves of vehicles, and I'll show you some pictures of that in a minute. And the study was to understand how brake fluid influences corrosion in a brake system and how influence changes in in-time service. Most of the corrosion in a brake system is caused by environmental contaminants like water, salt, and oxygen. Water, salt, and oxygen. What's your test now? You may find an answer there. Wheel cylinders and calipers are out in the environment, and they subject to heat cycles that can distort the sealing surfaces, and that's where contaminants are most likely to enter the brake system. Now, when I was talking a while ago about the wheel cylinders that had the rust pits on the inside, what would that be caused by, you think?
Wheels.
The ones that y'all had that were leaking that I said had rust pits on the inside, what's going to make rust pits on the inside?
Water.
Salt. And oxygen. I mean, think about it. I mean, all three of those, if it oxidizes, it rusts, and salt causes oxidation. See, and all that. All right, so, excuse me, the contaminants are most likely to enter the brake system out there where the hardest working parts are. And if somebody leaves a cap loose, but I'll tell you something, or if they pour contaminated brake fluid in it, but I'll tell you something that my rule of thumb on any system or anything that you're working on is, the part of that system that's working the hardest is the part that is going to fail, probably. In most cases, the part of it that's working the hardest and is in the most hostile environment is the part that will fail. That's not 100%, but it's a pretty good rule of thumb. Like, for instance, if you've got a gas gauge that has quit working, a fuel gauge, it typically, the most common cause of fuel gauge failure is that sending unit in the tank. Why? It's in the hostile environment and it's working the hardest. Got me? Okay, and I'm telling you, brake parts work real hard. All right. The report that they did on this thing, that NIST did, suggests environmentally caused corrosion may have always existed, but in vehicles without ABS brake system, it doesn't circulate through the system. The movement's more like a control cable in its housing. The fluid kind of moves back and forth, but it doesn't move around. But now in an ABS system, I'm talking about one with a pump. It's going to fire up that pump and it's going to circulate fluid through the system so the stuff goes all over the place. You see, the fluid and whatever contaminants are in it are going to circulate all over the place.
The ABS system is always working.
Yeah, unless there's some reason, if it has got a concern in that ABS, if that yellow ABS light's on, then it shuts that ABS system down and you got regular brakes. Okay, so just remember that. If it shuts it down, because of some kind of, like for instance, like when Webb was working the other day, I made a bug by unplugging a component so he'd find an ABS light. Right? Okay, so with that situation like it was, the ABS refuses to work anyway. It's just going to, the ABS computer is going to say, well, we don't want to fool around with the brakes if we think there may be a problem, so we're just going to go ahead and let him have regular brakes. Stopping's important, All right. In vehicles without ABS, though, like I say, you understand what I'm saying about the fluid moving back and forth? And something else that people get confused by when you're bleeding brakes, and this is the same deal. You got a brake line right here, and inside that brake line you got fluid, and you got bubbles in there. You know, let's say that you got an air pocket in there. All right. Now way on down here, you're going into this, you know, wheel cylinder and all that. I'm just going to draw this, and you got a bleeder screw right here, you know, on your top of your thing and all that. Okay. Now people will pump enough fluid through this pipe to where they're getting clear fluid with no bubbles in it here, and they're assuming that they've got all the air out of it. But what they don't realize is they've got a huge air pocket way back up here between the master cylinder and whatever they're trying to bleed, and it's slowly moving. It's pushing good, clean, you know, air fluid that doesn't have air in it ahead of it, but you got a big air pocket here. Well, they bleed and bleed and bleed, and they see that this is clear, and they say, well, why don't I still have no pedal? But it's because you got air back farther up. I mean, that line snakes all the way from the master cylinder to the back of the car. You get where I'm going? And so that's why sometimes you may not have you'll have more trouble than others bleeding your brakes. Especially, and I like to loosen all of the bleeders. And when I loosen all the bleeders and I put those 4 things on there, I go ahead and make full, don't pump it faster, you'll make foam. Got me? Just pump it real slow and long strokes. And you're basically moving this. See that one? Every time you let off, if you just leave it in there so that hose is underneath the level of the fluid in your catch container, it's not going to suck any air back in there. You got me? All right. But anyway, the back and forth motion of the fluid is one of the things that sometimes makes it hard to bleed. But the fluid touches the same parts of the system all the time. If it doesn't have ABS, it's pumping this stuff around. Any environmental contamination or corrosion is going to remain local. And over the years, better materials and coatings have been developed to survive those attacks. They coat the stuff a lot better on the inside than they used to. And so it's become less of a problem on newer cars. See, nobody, you know, a lot of the times, you know what planned obsolescence is? You ever heard of that term?
They want you to have to replace parts that are supposed to break.
They make the cars so that they'll wear out, so you'll have to buy another car in a couple of years or whatever. That's planned obsolescence. They don't do that with brakes. They ain't going to do it with the brakes. It's too dangerous. Now your trim parts and your other crud inside the car, the plastic junk that breaks, that, you know, makes the car just plumb unsavory to drive, you know, yeah, they're going to make that stuff and other little bits and pieces that aren't unsafe, you know. They'll do that. Let's say if a car gets to where it's looking bad enough, people are going to go ahead and get a nud, you know, and all that. So we make all the little fasteners all around this, that, and the other where it doesn't hold good and all that. But I mean, the safety parts of it, they're going to have to hang on to. Well, cars with ABS brake fluid circulates during ABS operation, and I need to actually play a video for y'all on so you can see that happen. The brake fluid circulates, so the deposits caused by environmental corrosion can be carried by the fluid all over it, and so the people in the field, us, we understand the kind of problems that can cause. Well, the study by the NIST also discovered another mechanism for brake system corrosion. In about a third of the test vehicles, corrosion was found on parts made of, you know, iron and steel, and many of the corrosion pits were filled with copper. Isn't that interesting? They would find pitted places on the iron and steel, you know, in their study, little places that were pitted, and they would find that they were filled with copper. Okay, and the researchers focused on how copper might be removed from the brake lines and deposited in the shallow pits in this iron. So the quote, the report, they said the copper in the brake lines corrodes at a slow rate over several months or years, resulting in copper ions in the brake fluid. Do you ever electroplate anything?
Don't know why you nickel plate something?
Or electroplate it with anything. I mean, if you take, you know, whatever you're going to electroplate it with, copper, brass, whatever, and you put something that you want to electroplate in here, and you negatively charge one, positive charge the other, ions go, and you can actually, you know, that's when they do that with gold. You know, they electroplate stuff by making it look like you got something that's made out of gold when it's actually got a super thin, and you didn't use hardly any of your source material because it's, you know, it's happening on the atomic level, you know, that kind of thing. I mean, we did that in science class when I was in the 5th grade. I mean, you got a key and a piece of copper, and you basically coated the key with copper by suspending it in this acid solution, you know. It's like an electrolyte. Pretty cool. But anyway, this happens in the brake line. The ions act as oxidizers and plate out in the APS valve when the corrosion inhibitors can't prevent corrosion of the ferrous components. The ferrous components being iron and steel. In other words, the brake fluid constantly corrodes the copper in the brake lines, and the copper leaches into the brake fluid as ions, atoms of electrical charge. When the corrosion inhibitors in the brake fluid eventually wear out, and they always do, the copper ions become the oxidizer that corrodes the parts made of iron and steel. Okay, so they have an electrical charge. The copper ions are attracted to the ferrous metals and are eventually electroplated into the pits. And that's not always a good thing. That's why we dip the little strip, and they call it, you know, what they call that, FASCAR, fast car, and the CAR is copper alpha reactions. That's what they're talking about. If there's copper ions in that fluid, and that little strip turns purple, it's time to change the brake fluid. You got me? The darker purple it turns, the more of that copper ions ever got in that fluid. And there's people that work on brakes every day in this country, and most of them do not know that. You know, they just figure, well, as long as the brakes are working, I'm not worried about it. And, you know, typically, like I say, you can, some of them don't want you to flush because of that. So, all right. So they're searching the causes of corrosion. The study focused on ways to measure it by measuring the conductivity of brake fluid. You can basically put your brake, your meter, like we did on that one worksheet, meter on the negative battery terminal, and dip it into the brake fluid and see if you're reading more than 0.3 volt. Remember that worksheet? Yeah. Everybody done that? Okay, so metals have got a high conductivity. Glass has low conductivity. The conductivity of liquids depends on the liquid itself, but a conductive material dissolved in a liquid will increase its conductivity. We also measure the voltage in the antifreeze. You know, basically, if you go from the negative battery terminal and dip your probe in the radiator, and if you got a lot in there, you're going to have a lot of rust in your radiator, you know, if you got electrolysis going on, which electrolysis is that ion transfer we were talking about. Brake fluids conductivity increases during the test that we were talking about when water is added, form a 2% solution. And that's a common real-world moisture content, but when copper ions were added, only 25% of the maximum allowed for brake fluid, conductivity increased by more than 6 times. So if it's got copper and water in there, see. But the copper alpha reaction dip is a better test, and that's why we use those little strips. That's the smoking gun, right? That's what they found. Measuring the conductivity of brake fluid gives a measure of the fluid's copper content, but our strips work better because, you know, that's just the way it is. Conductivity meters can do it. Test strips can indicate the presence of oxidation catalysts. But in vehicles without ABS, or where the ABS is not activated much, it's likely the fluid in the reservoir will have a lower reading than the rest of the system. You don't have any way to dip your strip into the brake line halfway between here and the wheel cylinder. You know, you can dip it into the one out here in where it's available to you and all that. So the bottom line is, the NIST looked only at brake fluid and how it might contribute to the corrosion of materials in the brake system. It did not study brake system and didn't even speculate on how corrosion might affect brake system operation. Okay? So anybody that notices color differences between new and used brake fluid knows brake fluid changes with age. I mean, you ever looked in there, you see how dark it is? I mean, you know, you've got brand new brake fluid. You got a brand new car, you got clear brake fluid. It looks so pretty, right? You notice in our Ranger, because we work on the brakes a lot, it's just pretty clear brake fluid all the time. You see, we're always pumping it through there. And it doesn't cost a lot to replace your brake fluid. Now, you do need to keep that master cylinder full or you'll make yourself a bleeding, you know, you have to bleed it, you know, don't let it run out. Ain't that right, Tyler? All right, then. Okay, so identifying color changes in the shop is kind of hard because so many different chemical changes are possible that color change is almost meaningless. So, without some kind of test equipment, there's no way to know the condition of the brake fluid, right? Brake fluid ages at different rates and in different ways. Depends on the climate and the way the vehicle is used. As safe bet vehicles in humid climates and in rust belt states will suffer corrosion in the hydraulic system due to moisture contamination, mostly at the calipers and wheel cylinders. Usually where you're going to have that. Vehicles in drier climates are going to suffer less environmental corrosion, like out in Texas, you know, where cars don't rust. In either case, vehicles with ABS will distribute that environmentally caused corrosion and or its residue throughout the hydraulic system, and that can jam ABS valves. Okay, a second non-environmental form of corrosion occurs when the brake fluid ages and its corrosion inhibitors become depleted because it's got corrosion inhibitors in it. And I'll tell you this, you think if you've got fluid and you're pouring it in there and it's got friction modifiers or corrosion inhibitors or anything like that, they're pretty much going to stay the same as long as that fluid's in there, but that stuff breaks down. In those Power Stroke diesels I used to work on, they had anti-foaming agents in the oil, And one of the ways that we would see if the anti-foaming gauges were break down, we'd look at the control oil pressure using a scan tool, and we were told, according to Ford's and Navistar International, you're supposed to take that diesel engine and hold the accelerator pedal on the floor and just let it thunder for about 3 minutes. And then you watch, and if it went over 1,350 pounds of control pressure, then your foaming additives were broken down, you need an oil change. However, when I would write articles about there, or when I teach about it, when I went to El Paso and Fort Worth and all of these places teaching these guys about power stroke diesels, and when you do that test, you need to do like Elvis and leave the building, because the mechanics working in the other service bays don't like this big thundering, you know, or if you're doing something that's going to make a lot of smoke come out of the pipe, you need to get outside. Don't do it in the shop, you know what I'm saying? I mean, let's just be civil here. But the speed of the corrosion is always influenced on outside conditions, or it may be, but the brake fluid itself controls the copper in the brake lines, and they travel through the hydraulic system without being circulated. You know, but they travel faster in vehicles with ABS. Okay. Now then, let me go over here. If we do decide to flush a brake system, it's critical to use factory specified brake fluid breeding procedure. You know, you remember the other day when y'all were bleeding, and then whenever you hooked a scan tool up, you were through. You know, it fired down. Not every ABS system's like that. On some of them, you bleed them normally. But if you look in your book, and it says, and you see if you go to the scan tool in there and you go and it says brake bleeding procedure, that might be a good thing to do, but you got to have a scan tool that'll talk both ways, you know. They worked. How long did y'all bleed them brakes before you found out you needed to turn on the scan tool?
All day.
Yeah, you worked for a long time. Then when they turned on the scan tool, it fired up that pump and the air was gone, wasn't it? Just slick as a button. Yeah. On some of them, though, it'll tell you to run that brake bleed procedure, and if it's still got a spongy pedal, run it again. I mean, they actually tell you to do it several times. Service in a hydraulic brake system has always been one of the most critical jobs anybody can do, and it's also one of the easiest to do correctly. If you do it right on vehicle with ABS, it's not so easy anymore every time, like I was just talking about, but the price of doing it incorrectly may be higher than the price of not doing it at all. Now, let's go through our test. Glycol either describes a group of a dozen different solvents. I keep saying either instead of ether. Describes a group of a dozen different solvents that can easily be mixed with other fluids, and that is true. Brake fluid must pass 13 different tests for approval. Is that right?
False.
False. How many? 14 tests. Okay. Now then, we got the next question is, when copper ions are added in a concentration, conductivity increases more than 7 times, and that's actually more than 6 times.
So that's false, huh?
That's false. According to the handout that I've just went over with you, some manufacturers recommend flushing the hydraulic system every year. That's false. Most of the corrosion in a brake system is caused by environmental contaminants like water, salt, and oxygen. That's true. Most of you guys heard that. And steel brake lines, which are made of spiral wrapped layers of steel and joined together with brazen alloy, contains copper. That's 6. That's actually true. And vehicles without ABS, where ABS is rarely activated, it's not likely the fluid reservoir would have a lower conductivity reading than the rest of the fluid in the system, and that's false. That's basically false. Okay, copper ions in brake fluid corrode ferrous metal parts, including the ABS control valves. Got that? That's true. Service in a hydraulic brake system has always been one of the most safety critical jobs anybody can do, and it's the easiest job to do correctly. That was the last point that I made, and that is a truebie. And electrical conductivity is the measure of materials' ability to transport an electric charge. That is true. All right. Anybody got any questions or comments?